Okay, we're going to continue with our study on Daniel, on the prophecy of Daniel. And as most things tend to happen, this is kind of expanding a little bit more than I thought it would. So I don't know how far we'll get today, but hopefully we'll get through some of it and then keep moving. Last week I spent a great deal of time giving you my reasoning for why I think that the decree, once we finally get to this decree, then that'll maybe 2 weeks from now, but once we finally get there, I want you to be ready to understand that I firmly stand on the idea or the belief that decree was a decree of Cyrus and not someone else. And I'm going to show you a couple of verses today that are going to help to nail that down in some prophecies regarding the events that happened. And today I want to talk a little bit about some of the events. So we're going to look at some of the prophecies concerning the overthrow of Babylon by Cyrus. We're going to look a little bit into what Babylon was. It was, I guess, it was a magnificent city for its day. And when you hear the description of it, I wish I had pictures, but it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, you've all heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world, probably. Well, I'm going to explain where those were and how that provided for that city. It was a magnificent place. And Nebuchadnezzar had truly built this city out of the desert. So, and then to have it destroyed in a night, the way that it was, and something that God had prophesied would happen at least 180 years before it did. It's a magnificent prophecy that was fulfilled to the letter. And I think you're going to see some of that in this morning's teaching. And the important part about this is that when you see how this was fulfilled, then you can trust prophecies that are yet unfulfilled, that God will bring them about exactly as He said He would. It's a magnificent study for that purpose. Now, we're going to start this morning. We want to look at Daniel chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2. We'll read it now, and then we'll get started with verse 1, which will take up the bulk of the morning. In the first year of Darius, the son of Azarias, the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. All right, that's as far as we're going to go this morning. Now, first, the first verse, and let me also say one other thing. There are some prayers in here that we'll probably get into next week. This is a prayer. Daniel is praying to God about something. This is the introduction into that prayer. So we're going to look at that prayer, and then finally we're going to get to the answer of the prayer. Okay, so remember that's what's in mind here, and that's incredibly important to understand how it was that Daniel prayed and how he went about it, because it helps us in our own prayer life. If we know what worked, we know Daniel gave this prayer and the answer to it. Well, when we get into situations, we can also look at the method in which he prayed and how we went about doing it, and it can help us to get through some of those times when we don't feel like our prayers are hitting through the ceiling. Okay, but that's for later. Okay, this prayer occurred in the first year of Darius, the son of Azarias, the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Now, Darius was the uncle of Cyrus. Okay, Darius was the uncle. Cyrus was Darius's nephew, and this was in the year that Cyrus besieged the city of Babylon and overthrew it. Okay, That's at the time that Daniel is starting this prayer, is at the very time that Cyrus overtook the city of Babylon. The overthrow of Babylon by the Medes was prophesied by both Isaiah and Jeremiah well in advance of the event. I want you to turn first to Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah prophesied, well, as we're going to see in a little bit, at least 180 years before this event happened. Jeremiah lived up until the captivity, but he didn't live all the way to the end. So his prophecy was dealing with a future event as well, as we're going to see here in a minute. In Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 1, it says, "The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see." Okay, so we're dealing with Babylon. And in verse 17 of the same chapter, if the pages will unstick, we read, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them." Who's them? Babylon, right? "I will stir up the Medes against them, and shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it." So here's a prophecy from Isaiah that he's going to raise up the Medes to come against Babylon. And this was almost 200 years before it happened. Over in Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 11, we read, "Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple." You see, eventually God gets around to avenging wrongs that are done. In this case, he used Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Jerusalem to punish them, but then he destroyed Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom to punish them for going against it, for destroying his temple. Okay? But it took 70 years. Now, I don't think there's anybody in the room that's 70 yet. Mike, you're almost there, right? So, I'm not there yet. 70 years is a long time. I mean, at least, granted, looking back, it doesn't seem like it was all that long ago that I was a kid, but still, it's a long time. So, for them to be in captivity that long, that's a very long time. Now, I want you to turn to Isaiah chapter 44. And we're going to look at some prophecies concerning the overthrow of Babylon by Cyrus. And you're going to begin to see why it is that I stand so firmly on his being the decree that is the starting point of the prophecy. Isaiah chapter 44, we're going to begin at verse 24. Isaiah 44:24. "Thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb, I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth abroad the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of the liars, and maketh diviners mad, that turneth wise men backward, and that maketh their knowledge foolish, that confirmeth the word of the servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah, ye shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof. That saith to the deep, Be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. That saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Now you remember last week I told you that those that hold to the chronology of Usher, the way they get around this decree of Cyrus is to say that Cyrus never specifically said in his decree that they could build the city. But I pointed out that doesn't make any sense, because where did they live while they were building the temple? But what does God say right here? The prophet Isaiah says, saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. You see, Cyrus, his job was to deal with the city as well as just the temple. Okay? Look at verse 1 of chapter 45. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. And now I also want you to look at verses 11 through 13 of the same passage. Now notice who we're talking about. We changed chapters, yes, but we're still talking about Cyrus. Okay? Verse 11, thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel and his Maker, ask me of the things to come concerning my sons, and concerning the work of my hands, command ye me. I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded. I have raised him up in righteousness, and will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for price nor reward, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, perhaps in the summary of the decree of Cyrus that we have in the Bible, and like I said last week, nobody's ever seen the actual decree. All we have is the biblical text. Okay? But we don't know exactly what it was that Cyrus said, because nobody has the absolute decree. But we've got God saying through the prophet Isaiah that Cyrus will be the one to build his city. What more do we need? If we're going to then say, well, we have to find some other decree, are you calling God a liar? God prophesied through Isaiah that Cyrus would build the city. Therefore, that's good enough for me. I'll stand on that one and say Cyrus was the one that gave the decree to build the city. I don't need any more than that. Maybe I'm a simpleton, but now let's look at a couple of points of this. Cyrus is called, in the passage we just read, he's called the Lord's anointed and his shepherd to perform all his pleasure. The Lord held his right hand to subdue nations before him. That's in that passage. The ancient Greek historian Xenophon relates that he subdued the Syrians, Assyrians, Arabians, Cappadocians, both the countries of Phrygia, the Lydians, somebody I can't pronounce, the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, and a whole bunch of, basically the world. The known world at the time. Cyrus subdued all of it. And the Lord greatly enriched him with the spoils of these conquests. Cyrus issued the decree that permitted the Jews to move back into Jerusalem. I want you to turn to Ezra chapter 1. Ezra's back in the historical books just before Nehemiah. Ezra chapter 1. And this is what we have of the decree of Cyrus. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. And remember, we read over there in Jeremiah that the 70-year captivity. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whoso remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver, and with gold, and with goods, and with beasts, beside the freewill offering is for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Okay? So there's the decree. That's what we have of it. And granted, it does not mention the city. But logically, how are you going to build the temple if you don't have a place to live? And why is it that God would get mad at you for staying in your sealed houses and not finishing his temple? You see, there's just too many problems with this idea that we have to push that decree forward. Also, for 82 years, you can go back to the city, but for another 82 years before you can do anything, I think it's best to ignore Usher at this point in his chronology and just trust what God told us over in the prophecy of Isaiah. We don't need Usher, and we don't need some Egyptian astronomer estimating time based on eclipses that happened 600 years before he was born. It just doesn't logically make sense to me. So the Lord, okay, a couple of things that are pointed here. One of the things he did in the prophecy that we read over in Isaiah, one of the things that was accomplished by this was he let the Lord's captives go, not for price or reward as Isaiah had prophesied. He didn't charge anybody for this. In fact, if anything, he paid. Much of the bill for this enterprise was footed out of the Persian treasury. They paid for this. They paid for these people to go back. Cyrus was thus authorized and empowered and enriched by God for Jacob my servant's sake and Israel mine elect, that had this nation that had languished under oppression for the last 70 years. And so therefore, watch, if we go back and look at the prophecy, and we don't need to, but if you go back and read it again, notice the way it's worded. God takes the credit for everything that Cyrus did, because God was directing Cyrus to do everything that he did. He made sure that everything fell into place the way it needed to fall into place, so that everything that he wanted to accomplish came about. Okay? And all of this was done for the benefit of God's chosen people. Consider that. You have God's chosen people languishing away in captivity, and so God directs the paths of a pagan king to rescue them from this captivity and to deliver them from it. All of this that went on around Babylon as a result of what Cyrus was doing was all directed by God for his people. Don't lose sight of that. This was for his people. When Cyrus issued the decree to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem, we just read it. You noticed he acknowledged that God had charged him to build him a house. This wasn't his idea. God charged him to do this. We read already in Isaiah 44:28. Let me go back and make sure that I get it right. 44:28. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. And in Isaiah 45:13, we already read in the second half of the verse that he shall build my city. Matthew Henry said this concerning this verse. Two things Cyrus must do for God. One, Jerusalem is God's city, but it is now in ruins, and he must rebuild it. That is, he must give orders for the rebuilding of it and give wherewithal to do it. Number two, Israel is God's people, but they are now captives, and he must release them freely and generously, not demanding any ransom nor compounding them with price for reward, which is exactly what he did. He let them go freely, as Christ lets us go freely from our sins. So when we consider this, God established the Medo-Persian Empire with the end in view of his house where his people assembled for worship. In other words, his church. That empire was formed for the specific reason of gathering his people, or a remnant of his people, out of the world system and bringing them into his church. He did this so that 49,697 Jews, that's it, 49,697 Jews, a very small remnant of the nation, could return back and have a church. You say, well, where in the world did you get those numbers from, Pastor? Well, look at Ezra. Back to Ezra chapter 2. Ezra chapter 2, verses 64 through 65. There's a listing in chapter 2 of all of the children from all of the different tribes and families, and when we get down to verse 64, it says the whole congregation together was 42,303 score, besides their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. And then over in Ezra chapter 9, Ezra 9 verses 8 and 9. And now for a little space, grace hath been showed from the Lord our God to leave us a remnant to escape, and to give us a nail in his holy place, that our God may lighten our eyes and give us a little reviving in our bondage. Do all the math, add it all up, and you end up with 49,697 Jews that left Babylon and went back to Jerusalem. A very small remnant. That kind of makes it look like church and true worship of God's kind of important to God, right? Don't you think? That he would raise up an empire to rescue a small remnant of his people, to bring them back to church? Makes it look like church is kind of important. Now, computing the time from the time during which Isaiah delivered his prophecies to the time that Cyrus overthrew Babylon, we can estimate that the prophecy was delivered at least 180 years before it was fulfilled. At least 180. In Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 1, we read, the vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So his prophecy ran through the period of these kings, and their reigns totaled 113 years. You take the reigns of those kings and they total 113 years. After the reign of Hezekiah, there were 7 more kings in Judah, and their reigns total 110 years. Okay? Then came the Babylonian captivity, which lasted for 70 years. So from the end of Hezekiah's reign until the Babylonian captivity was 110 years, and the captivity was 70 years. So the farthest point, the shortest period of time that you can have is from the end of Hezekiah to the first year of Cyrus, and that would be 180 years. Probably considerably longer than that, but That's the shortest period of time that you could have. It's 180 years. The period from the end of Hezekiah to the end of the captivity. Now, to put this into perspective, we live in the year 2019. 180 years ago was the year 1839. And I know no one in this room was around then. 1839. Martin Van Buren was the President of the United States at that time. And he was the 8th President of the U.S. What are we at now, 45? And he was the 8th. There were another 7 presidents between him and Abraham Lincoln, and another 22 years before Lincoln became president. That's a long time ago. That's really a long time ago. For a prophet to make this prophecy and then have it fulfilled exactly as it was 180 years beforehand. Based on the earliest estimate of Cyrus' birth, we estimate that he was named in this prophecy at least 120 years before he was even born. And he was named in the prophecy. 120 years ago was the year 1899. And here's an interesting little fun fact. That's the first year that the word automobile came into existence. So, long time ago that these prophecies were made. Now, let's take a look at this city of Babylon that had been built by Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, Babylon was founded by Nimrod way back when, and he's the one that brought idolatry into, and the Tower of Babel was built and crushed, but Nebuchadnezzar is the one that built this kingdom. The city was, it was built, like I say, I wish I had pictures. I've seen maps, but I wasn't able to find anything that I could actually put on a PowerPoint and show you. But the city was built roughly in a square. Not perfectly square, but roughly square. It was surrounded by 2 walls, because you remember they would wall in cities back then. That was their defense. If you built a strong enough wall, then nobody could crush through your wall and take your city. Okay, each one of these walls was 14 miles long. So you had 14 miles, 14, 14, and 14 roughly in a square. Okay, 56 miles all the way around this thing, around this wall. This city was 196 square miles, which is roughly 2.5 times the size of Lakeland, Florida. It's a lot of land. Big city. This outer wall was surrounded by a very wide moat that went all the way around the city. Okay? That outer wall was 300 feet high, 25 feet thick, with another inner wall that was 75 feet behind the first wall, and the wall extended 35 feet below the ground to keep anybody from trying to tunnel in. It was broad enough for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other. They could have chariot races on the top of the walls. Within the wall, there were 100 solid brass gates, 25 on each section. And it contained a total of 250 towers that were 450 feet tall. The inner wall was not quite as broad as the other, because it was 75 feet inside. It was only 42 miles around, or each section was about 10.5 miles long. Between these 2 walls is where the hanging gardens of Babylon were. That's where they grew the food, the provisions. That's a pretty good size area to be growing food for this city between these walls. The Babylonians believed that they had enough provision to withstand a 20-year siege. Now, I've gone over this in other messages before. In ancient lands, back in the days of walled cities, the only way you could take a city was to surround it. That's all you could do. Surround it and wait until the people get hungry. And eventually they'll come walking. That's what they did in Vicksburg. That's what Grant did in Vicksburg during the Civil War. He had it surrounded where nobody could go in. They couldn't get any provisions in. Nobody could go out. And eventually they ran out of food. And when you run out of food, you kind of lose your gumption to go fight anymore, and you come walking out waving a white flag. That's the way we used to fight. We don't do that anymore because nobody has walled cities. But during the era of walled cities, they would surround the city. Now it's going to be hard to surround something that's 14 by 14 by 14 by 14 miles. That's going to take a heck of an army to have enough troops to go all the way around this 196 square mile city. Okay? So the chances of that happening are slim and none. Just aren't enough people. And they had provisions within the city. They were able to grow their own food in there. They could have lasted forever. They were self-contained. So they were even though they knew Cyrus was coming, they weren't concerned with it. Didn't bother them. They didn't have to fear for that. They had all their provisions that they needed. No one could stay there long enough or siege the city the way that cities were normally sieged. Now, one other interesting point about this, their water source was the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River ran right smack dab down the middle of the city of Babylon. And there were gates at both ends to keep anybody from coming into the city after dark. They would lock those gates so that you couldn't come in. And on either side of the city there were walls that divided the city into an eastern and a western sector. And within those walls there were other large gates of brass, so if you came in on a boat and the gates were locked, you can't get in. Between the bank of the river and the walls there was a dock that was 87 feet wide. That's a pretty good sized dock. You could pull a Carnival Cruise Line ship up against something like that. Both sides of the city were linked together by a large bridge that had a drawbridge in it, that they would open the drawbridge at night so you couldn't get across it. And the banks of the river were bricked to maintain it so they had a seawall, in other words. You've seen some of that like around Tampa where they have seawalls built so that to stop any erosion from the water knocking. Well, that's the way Babylon was. It was a completed city. It was a magnificent place. They had dug a huge holding lake to hold back the waters when they built this city. So they dug a lake on the upstream side of the river, built a dam, dammed off the water so it could go into that lake, while they built the seawall and built all of the fortifications around it, and then knocked the dam down and let the water flow back through the city again. Okay? Now here's an interesting account of how Cyrus took this city that you can't siege. You don't have enough people to surround it, and it wouldn't do any good if you did. It's all locked down at night. You can't go through the river because there's gates on either end there that you can't get through in a boat. How are you going to take the city? Okay? Here's how he did it. Now, before he took Babylon, he conquered Susa, which is the capital of Elam, which lay to the east of Babylon. Okay? So they knew he was coming. And then he defeated the Babylonian army at the Battle of Opis, which lay to the north of Babylon. Interestingly enough, you don't need to turn here, but you might want to make note of it. This fulfills a couple of prophecies. In Isaiah chapter 46 and verse 11, it describes him as a ravenous bird from the east, which would have been the capture of Susa. And in Isaiah 41:25, it described him as one from the north, which covers his defeat of the Babylonian army at Opis. And he's planned a surprise attack on the night of a great pagan festival that was being observed in Babylon. As the case of many festivals, this festival was a time of revelry and drunkenness, as we're going to see in a couple of minutes. And you know, this is not an uncommon trait or tactic in warfare. It's not uncommon at all. Most of you know that George Washington crossed the Delaware, right? Do you know when? Do you know what day he crossed the Delaware? December 25th. The evening of December 25th, when all of the, I think they were Hessians, which is who he was going after, when they were all sleeping off their party from Christmas Day, knowing that early in the morning they'd all be hung over, and that was when he attacked. It's not uncommon to do that. Ho Chi Minh launched the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, which was right smack dab in the middle of the Vietnamese New Year, when nobody expected it. So this is not uncommon to launch an attack against an enemy at a time when they're busy doing something else. Now, in order to gain entry to the city, Cyrus diverted the river into that large holding lake and into another channel that he dug. Okay? See, the one mistake they made was when they knocked down the dam, they never filled up the holding facility for the water. So Cyrus just dammed up the river and ran it over into that holding lake, and that allowed the armies of Cyrus to enter the city underneath the gates of the river. Okay, and that fulfilled a prophecy that we've already read, Isaiah 44:27, that saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up the rivers. Now, gaining entrance into the city, you still got the problem of those large brass gates. But on that night, the guards apparently forgot to lock them. Left them unlocked. John Gill said, but what is more remarkable, the gates of brass which shut up the descents from the quays to the river were left open that night Babylon was taken, while the inhabitants were feasting and reveling, which had they been shut would have defeated the enterprise of Cyrus, but God in his providence ordered it to be so. So on the night Cyrus came into the city, gates were open. They walked through them. And that fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 45:1, the gates shall not be shut. According to Xenophon again, it says, when Cyrus came to the gates of the king's palace, he found them shut. When the king of Babylon heard a loud noise being made, he ordered that the gates be opened to ascertain what was going on. When the gates were opened, the soldiers of Cyrus rushed in and slew the king. And this remarkably fulfills Isaiah 45:1, I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates. I'll have more to say about the loosing of the loins here in just a minute. Turn to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. We're not going to read the entire chapter, but we'll read a good chunk of it. Begin at reading verses 1 through 6. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. So this king orders them to go get the vessels that had come from the temple of God, that they could use them for wine goblets. Okay? Not very respectful, is it? Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, and of stone. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. I don't know how to put this any more delicately than it just scared the poop out of him. And his joints were loosed, or his loins were loosed. He literally, it scared him that bad. Well, so then he calls in all of his magicians and everyone else to try to tell him what this thing means. What's this? And they couldn't do it. And so finally somebody reminds him of Daniel. And we skip down to verse 17, where it says, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, he was going to reward him with something. And Daniel said, I don't need your reward. I'll tell you what it is. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride. He was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. You know what, leaders, all of us better remember where it is that we get our stuff from. If God raises you up, don't forget that God's the one that raised you up. God's the one that gave you your mind. God's the one that gave you the ability to do what you do. Don't ever forget that. Nebuchadnezzar lost sight of it and was driven into the fields. So don't ever lose sight of where things, if you have understanding of the Word, don't ever lose sight that you got that understanding because God gave it to you. Because without Him, you can't understand anything. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. So God's the one that sent the hand to send this message to Belshazzar. This is the writing that was written. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This was going on at the very minute that Cyrus was entering the city of Babylon. Verse 29, then command, well, we don't need verse 29. Let's go down to, skip down to verses 30 and 31. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So that very night, during the party, when the guy got the writing on the wall, that was the night that Cyrus overtook the city. Now, interestingly enough, during this feast, they were drinking wine, they were praising their idols, they're just having a good old time, right? Look at Jeremiah 51. It's another prophecy concerning Babylon. Jeremiah 51, verses 38 and 39. They shall roar together like lions. They shall yell at lions' whelps. In their heat I will make their feasts, and I will make them drunken, that they may rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, saith the Lord. Jeremiah prophesied that they would die in their drunkenness, which they absolutely did. Now, one interesting thing, a point that I started to make early, and now I'm going to go ahead and finish it up. The beginning of Daniel chapter 9 says that in the first year of Darius, and I made the point that Darius was the uncle of Cyrus. Okay, Cyrus was his nephew. The ancient historian Xenophon reports that Darius, this Darius of the Mede, who was the uncle of Cyrus, that Cyrus allowed him the title of all of his conquests as long as he lived. And at that point he was 62 years old. He lived for another 2 years. But what Cyrus did as a reward to his uncle was anytime that they would conquer something, he would put it in his uncle's name rather than his own. That helps to solve a lot of these problems of which guy's which and a lot of those other issues that might come up. Okay, we're back to our Daniel chapter 9 again, verse 2. This is only going to take a couple of minutes, and then we'll close for this morning. Verse 2, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Okay, notice first that he knew by books, plural, more than one. He had more than one witness. And he mentioned Jeremiah. Now we've already looked at prophecies in Isaiah that mention how this is all going to come about. And we've seen it from Jeremiah as well. So those are the two books, obviously, that he's talking about. It was written that the prophecies were in Isaiah, the prophecies were in Jeremiah. So that's where he was going to get these. The actual prophecy in Jeremiah that's read, that's found in Jeremiah 25. Back the other way. Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 and 12. And this whole land shall be a desolation, referring to Jerusalem, and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years, and it shall come to pass, when the 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. Think about this for a minute. This was a long time ago. Babylon was destroyed in the 400 BCs. Has it ever become anything other than a wasteland? It's the middle of Iraq. You look at pictures of our troops when they were in Iraq. It's nothing like it was when Nebuchadnezzar had it. Is it? I don't see any magnificent structures there other than the ones that maybe Saddam Hussein had. It's been perpetual desolations ever since the time of Nebuchadnezzar. It's never been rebuilt, anything like that. It's never become anything other than just a place for vagabonds to hang out. Now there's another promise, a prophetic promise that I want you to look at, because this must have given Daniel encouragement to pray for the restoration of this city. And we'll close on this point. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10. For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Then shall ye call on me, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. And ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart, and I will be found of you, saith the Lord, and I will turn away your captivity, and I will gather from you all the nations, and from all the places whither I have driven you, saith the Lord, I will bring you again into the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive. Reading that, if I were Daniel, I would think I need to start praying. This would give you the encouragement to do it, knowing that the 70 years are just about up. And that's at the beginning of the time that he starts the prayer that we'll start to look at next week. There's two parts to it. There's his prayer of confession to begin with, and then there's a prayer of supplication after that, and then there's the answer to the prayer. So it may take us a couple more weeks to get through it, but I think we can move on. And once we get to the answer, then we'll deal with the Cyrus thing a little bit more when we get to the actual answer. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.